Sorry, let me just. Today's daf in Masechet Zevachim is daf Lamed Hey, 35 already. And yesterday, we were in the middle of a sugya when we stopped. And the discussion yesterday was about our Mishnah, which said that if you did something in the avoda of the Mizbeach, that's with a puzzle. So, for example, you did it with your left hand, or you did it with a non-Kohen, you can repeat it. So if a non-Kohen took the blood, give it back to the Kohen and do it properly. Um, and we said, how's that possible? Why isn't it puzzle once you do something wrong? Why doesn't it make the whole thing not work? And we said it's we had two answers. One is that it's the Tana who says that it doesn't get puzzled that way. And the other answer was that because it's biyado, to fix it, it doesn't make a psul. So anything that you can take your own hand and fix what you've done, it doesn't make it dichoy. It doesn't push it off from ever being able to be used again. Excuse me. And then we brought our proof from Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda said this crazy halacha that when they brought the carbon Pesach on Erev Pesach, and they had hundreds, if not thousands of people, probably thousands of people bringing carbonot in the Azara, they would close up the drains, they would stop up the drains so that the blood wouldn't flow out and it would basically pool on the floor of the Azara. And it sounds like the reason we did that is because at the end of the shift or the end of the day, they would pick up blood from the floor and put it on the mizbeach, so that in case anyone's carbon got puzzle essentially by it spilling the blood, this would make it kosher again. So we said that's a proof that even though when the animal's blood spilled on the floor, it was puzzle at that moment, the fact that you can then fix it by picking up blood from the floor, putting the mizbeach, makes it that it's not a psul. So that's what we talked about yesterday. Now we started, I'm gonna go from the Daf Lamed Hey, the third line. We read a little bit of this yesterday. I'm going to read it quickly again because it's important for the sugya. We said, but the fact is that the blood that's on the floor consists of blood that comes out of the animal's neck immediately when it dies, which is called dam hanefesh, but then also blood that seeps out, flows out later, called dam hatamsit, which is the secondary blood, the blood from the organs. And that's not kosher for the Mizbeach. So ask the Gemara, the third line of Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph, V'alo dama tamsit muravbo. How could you pick up blood from the floor and put it on the Mizbeach if dam of the tamsit, the other blood that oozes out of the animal, is mixed up into it? Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda l'tamei. That's Rabbi Yehuda's shita as a tana. The Amar dama tamsit kri dam. In fact, Rabbi Yehuda holds the dama tamsit is blood. The Tanya, as we learned in a Braita in Kritut, dama tamsit, if someone eats blood that's not the dam hanefesh, not the original blood that came out of the animal, but the secondary blood, ba'azhara, they are chayiv and ashara, meaning it's a lo taseh. And the Gemara in Kritut learns out where we know it, but it's not karet. Rabbi Yehuda Omer bikaret. Rabbi Yehuda says no. In fact, even dam hatamsit is primary blood, and it's also chiv karet. Says Gemara, that's true in eating blood. Amar Rabbi Elazar, the Rabbi Elazar is quoted as saying, Moda Rabbi Yehuda le'inin kapara she'enu mechaper. Rabbi Yehuda admits that you can't get a kapara from putting dam hatamsit on the mizbeach. Shenemar, as it says, ki hadam hu benefesh yichaper. Right? Dam, I mean the dam of the nefesh is mechaper. Dam shehanefesh yotzeh bo karoi dam. The blood that the soul of the animal leaves with, meaning that it dies with, it's called dam. Shehan nefesh yotzeh bo in karoi dam. So therefore, putting the blood on the mizbeach with dam tamsit is not appropriate. So how could you pick up blood from the floor that's including all kinds of mixed blood and put it on the mizbeach? Ella says, that's not a problem because Rabbi Yehuda l'tamei, it's Rabbi Yehuda's own shita, which we're going to have later, and we actually quoted before in Avodah Zarah and many other places. Rabbi Yehuda l'tamei d'amar ein dam mivatel dam. Rabbi Yehuda holds that min is not mivatel mino. Remember, ein min mivatel mino. We had this debate, but blood does not cancel other blood. So the fact is that in the cup you have a lot of blood. Some of it is dam hanefesh, some of it is dam tamsit, but the fact that some of it is dam tamsit is not a problem because it doesn't cancel it. It's shouldn't be going on the mizbeach, but we're doing it because we want to be machshir the animals from the dam hanefesh. Says the Gemara, well, where am I? Amar lahem Rabbi Yehuda, right? Am I? Yeah. Said Rabbi Yehuda to them, l'divrei. Now, according to you, the Chachamim, that picking up blood from the floor and putting it on the mizbeach is not helpful. Lama pokikin azara, right? Why in the world do you stop up the azara? Why do you want all this blood to be on the floor if it's not for the purpose of picking it up at the end of the day and putting it on the mizbeach? Amar lo, so the Chachamim said to Rabbi Yehuda, we do it for a whole nother reason, because it makes a really great spectacle of the whole scene. Shevachu lebnei Aaron. It's a praise. It's a beautiful thing for the sons of Aaron. Sheyalchu ad arkavoteim bedam. That they're walking in their ankles in blood. It's like showing that we have so many people doing karbanot, sacrificing to Hashem, that the blood is running thick to God. So the same way, those there are some people, of course, who are very afraid of blood. But in the Azar, hopefully a Kohen is not, because in the Mizbeach and in the Azara, blood rolled, right? And this is basically a show that there's so much chiba, so much love of Hashem, that we have so much blood from karbanot. Says the Gemara of Hadam Havi Chatzitzel, right? Well, the problem is it's a very nice thing. But remember the Kohanim, we learned this in the first parak, they have to walk on the floor. If you're walking on blood, the blood seems to be a separation. You can't say you're walking on the floor. It says, no, lachi, it was wet. Right? Things that are moist are not a chatzitza. That's not, as the Mishnah says. Hadam, if you have blood or dio or ink or dvash or honey or chalav or milk, if they're yeveshim, if these things dry up, right, these are all liquids that can dry out, like ink, of course, then the chotzitzim. If they're dry, they're chatzitza, but lachim ain't chotzitzim. But if they are moist, they don't have chatzitza. So as long as the blood in the floor of the azara was still flowing and still moist, it wouldn't be a chatzitza. I asked the Gemara, "V'aka mitvasi ma'anayo." Doesn't it dirty the clothes of the Kohen, right? Because of course blood makes clothes dirty. But it's not. I remember we had, or Tanya really, we had this bright. I think we learned it together. It says Daf Yud. I can't read Yud Gimel, but I remember learning it maybe 3 weeks ago together. We learned in the Mishnah, in the Breita, sorry, hayu begadav metushtashim. If the Kohen's clothing are dirty, va'avad, and they do avodatam psula. So remember, we learned earlier that it's not beautiful, and the Kohen has to have clean clothing. So how could a Kohen walk in blood? The blood obviously will lap up and get absorbed into his tunic and make it dirty, right? So how do you explain that? So how do you explain that? Says the Gemara, well, maybe, and this remember this was the discussion we had earlier, that they can pick up their clothing. Maybe you tie the belt. Remember, if you tie the belt higher, your shirt comes up and goes up past your ankles. But remember, we learned earlier that was a problem, right? So let's read that. If you say it's because they raised their clothing up by tying up, making their belt tighter. But Tanya, but we learned and we discussed this earlier. It says in the pasuk mido that it has to be mido, exactly his size, kemidato, meaning shali yachsav shali yotir. It can't be too short. It can't be too long. The clothing has to be very well fitted for the Kohen. So he can't pull it up and do the avodah. It says, well, you're right. During the avodah, the Kohen cannot do that. But when would they walk in the blood? Only when they were doing things that were not avodah. For example, holachat evarim lekevesh. So when they were doing the shechita and the zrika and all of that, they were not walking in the blood. But when they were bringing the parts up to the mizbeach, there they would hike up their skirts and would walk through the blood to do it. So it was beautiful, but it wasn't really avodah because you don't need to do. Remember, even if you don't burn the parts, you get a kapara once you do the zrika. The lav avodahi. It's not avodah. Latanya hikriv hakohen etakol. Right? It says the Kohen brings everything, and we learned earlier zu halachat evarim lekevesh. It says the Kohen, when he's a Kohen, has to put the ivarim on the ramp. Elna, you're right. The part that the Kohen would do with the blood in his feet was holachat itzim lemaracha, lav avodahu. When you're carrying wood, we talked about this yesterday a little bit, right? There was a tremendous need for wood on the Beit HaMikdash. They burned and burned and burned. And so they had a lot of people whose job it was to gather the firewood from whatever stores they had, from the Lishkat HaItzim, and to bring it to the Mizbeach. And so those Kohanim would walk through the blood to show, they would pick up their skirts because they didn't want to get their clothing dirty, and they would walk through the blood to show that they are both steeped in the blood of the karbanot and, of course, not essentially doing an avodah, so it doesn't passel it. Ask the Gemara, so that's a great solution. The only problem is, how could you say that the floor of the Azar is covered with blood and you only walk through it when you bring the wood? What about the other people? How do they avoid the blood? Right? How do the people shechting the animal, zrika the animal? How do they avoid the blood? Says the Gemara, lavoda hechi azli, azlia it's to be. They used to make platforms. So basically, they would have raised platforms. Rashi says they were not a chatzitza because they were part of the Azara, meaning it was made there as Rashi says, stones that were considered to be min haritzba. It's like an extension of the floor. So they would have a raised pathway. Basically, you would shech the animal on the raised pathway. You would walk on it, sprinkle it on the mizbeach, and other parts of the Azara were full of blood. So don't fall off the pathway. You fall into the moat full of blood. But the reason they did that was to make it beautiful as a beautiful thing to show how wonderful and numerous are the korbanot bringing bracha to Hashem. Okay, so that is, and we discussed this, of course, in Zevachim, but it's a beautiful vision of the Beit HaMikdash in all of its blood and guts. Continues the Mishnah now, middle of Daf Lamed Hey Amid Aleph. Remember, we said in the previous Mishnah, we are talking about a pigul and things like that. And we said that if you shecht an animal, or do Kabbalah, or Halacha, or Zrika, with the thought to eat something that is appropriate to be eaten, right? Or to burn something that's appropriate to be burnt, then it becomes pigul. Our Mishnah does the negative of that. Let's say you think, I'm going to shech this animal, and tomorrow I'm going to eat a part that you don't normally eat. Let's say the skin of the animal, right? You don't normally eat the skin of an animal, except for one skin. Remember we said under the aliyah, that's very thin, but most skin is not edible. So shochedet hazevach, you shecht an animal, le'echol davar she'in darko le'echol. And you're thinking tomorrow, or whatever, or outside the Beit HaMikdash, I'm going to eat a part that is not normally eaten. Or lahaktir davar she'en lahaktir. Or I'm going to put on the mizbeach a part that's not normally put on the mizbeach. Kasher. That doesn't passel the carbon because your machshava does not count because it's not referring to a thing that's normally done. And Rabbi Eliezer posel, Rabbi Eliezer disagrees because he holds that in fact you can have a thought about eating for something that's supposed to be burned or for burning something that's supposed to be eaten. Now, let's say you have two thoughts. You think lechol davar shedarko lechol ulhaktir davar shedarko ulhaktir, but it's pachot mikazayit. So you think I'm going to eat the right thing. I'm going to eat meat tomorrow. Or I'm going to burn the limbs tomorrow, but I'm going to do a small amount. Kasher. It's not a problem because only a kazayit passes. What if, remember we had this before, lechol kechatzi zayit, lahaktir kechatzi zayit. I'm going to eat half a zayit. I'm going to burn half a zayit. Then the animal's still kasher. Shein achilav haktara mitzdarfin. Because you don't combine two different actions, right? One is eating of a person, one is eating of the mizbeach, haktara, they don't combine. Continue. Now the Mishnah enumerates what are some of these specific things that are not considered food. Hashochetet hazevach lechol kazayit min ha'or. You shech the animal, you're thinking I'm going to eat a kazayit of the skin. Again, the skin is usually not edible except for maybe some small parts. Min harotav. Rotav we usually translate as the sauce or gravy, but it means things that really are like when you boil down the animal, they like drop to the bottom, like the dregs almost, but not considered to be generally edible. Min hakepa. Stop doing that. From the kepa, which again is the same. Rashi understands the kepa is what I just described. That after you cook, parts, hard parts fall to the bottom that are really not the part you eat. Min ha'alal. The word alal also, these are all very complicated words because there's disagreement about what they mean. Rashi here says alal means the gidim, right? So gidim are we translate gidim as the tendons, right? In the neck. Rashi says the alal are specifically the ones in the neck that are very hard and not edible. That some gidim, if you cook them long enough, you can eat them, but the ones in the neck are very, very strong and you can't eat them. Min ha'atzamot, if you say I'm going to eat some of the bones, and again, not the marrow, but the bone itself. Min ha'gidim, gidim is what we usually think of as the general tendons. Min ha'karnayim, karnayim are literally mean the hooves, the horns, sorry. Karnayim are the cow's things, right? The horns. Min ha'tlafayim, or the hooves. All of these things, and it's not just necessarily the things, but even if there's a little bit of meat on them, those are not generally edible things, and therefore if you do it chutz l'zman or chutz l'mkomo, it's still kasher because it's not considered to be a thought at all. And same thing would be true if it's tamei and you eat it, you didn't eat anything. If it's notar and you eat it, you didn't eat anything. It's not considered to be edible. Now, continues the Mishnah. What if you're shochet muktashim? Now, if you shecht an animal, lechol shalil, you have in mind to eat the shalil. Shalil means the fetus, the baby, right? Inside the woman. Obviously, the muktashim here has to mean a female animal because male animals will not have a shlil. Oshilya, shilya is the placenta, right? The outside area of the, I don't tell you about fertility, but the outside area, right, that supports the baby's development. Bachutz, if you say, I'm going to eat those parts outside the Beit HaMikdash, lo pigel, that thought does not make it pigel because that is not normally eaten. Okay? Now we're gonna again discuss this in the Gemara. How hamoleka tatovim. Now let's say you shecht a bird. Remember the way you shecht a bird is called malika, where you cut off the head with your fingernail. But you do that act, and birds, of course, don't have babies. What do birds have, Nava? eggs. And your thought is lechol beitzehem b'chutz. I'm going to eat the egg of this bird, right? You slaughter the bird. Inside the bird, it might be an egg or a raw egg. You're going to eat that outside the Beit HaMikdash. Lo pigel. That also does not make pigel. Again, we will discuss this in the Gemara. Now, what about chalev? What about the milk? Hamuktashim ubeitzei torim. So you think I'm going to slaughter this cow and it's an udders full of milk or whatever the area is called. I'll take out that milk and I'll drink that tomorrow outside in my coffee, or eggs of torim. Now we'll see why eggs of torim are different than, excuse me, than what we just said. I mean, they're not different, but sorry, the first part was you thought, I'm going to shech the animal on condition that I'm going to eat something tomorrow. The second case in the Mishnah is you actually eat the thing, right? When you're tameh or when you're outside the Beit HaMikdash or when it's notar. Says our Mishnah, then it's not food. Chelev muktashim ubeitzei torim, the milk from animals that are slaughtered or eggs from birds that are killed, ein chayavim aleim mishum pigol notar v'tameh, they are not considered to be edible stuff from the mother, and therefore you're not chayav pigol notar and tameh. And we will see why in the Gemara. Now, says Reb Elazar, and the whole Gemara for the rest of today is going to be discussing this sort of distinction, which is that there's two parts. There's mifagel or mitpagel, meaning if a person has a thought while they're doing a karban, they're saying, tomorrow I'm going to eat the hoof of the animal. The Mishnah said that's not pigel because a thought about the hoof is not considered to be thought of eating, right? The other point of the Mishnah is that let's say a person slaughters an animal and thinks, I'm going to eat a regular piece of steak from this animal tomorrow. That's pigel. The animal becomes pigel. And then the next day he eats the meat on the hoof. That's not considered eating pigel because eating the thing is not considered eating. So thinking about it is not considered pigel. And once it is pigel, it doesn't become, meaning the hoof does not become part of the pigel, only the meat becomes part of the pigel. So it's not mifagel, meaning thinking about it doesn't make pigel, and it's not mitpagel, doesn't become pigel in an animal that's pigel. Says Rabbi Elazar, that's a little bit different when you come to the fetus. Because says Rabbi Elazar, pigal bezevach. If a person hasn't thought, I'm going to take shechting this animal, and tomorrow I'm going to eat a piece of it in the wrong place, or not in the wrong place, I'm going to eat a piece of it in the wrong time, so tomorrow, the animal becomes pigel. And then nitpagel hashlil. Then the fetus in that animal also is pigel. And if you eat the fetus, you're chayiv for a pigel. But if you think about the shalil, lo nitpagel hazevach, right? That's our Mishnah. If you say, I'm going to shech this animal and my intention is tomorrow I'm going to eat the fetus, that's not considered chutz l'zmano, and the zevach does not become pigel. So the shalil, according to Rebbe Lazar, is in between. It becomes pigel, but it doesn't make the animal pigel. Pigel be'alal, says Rebbe Lezer further, if you have pigul by alal, the alal of the animal is usually some, Rashi mentions again, some part of the neck that is basically more edible in a bird. Alal, we're talking about a bird than in a large animal, right? So then if you made it pigul ba'alal, sorry, that's the mura. I take it back. The pigal ba'alal means the normal meat of the bird. So you do malika on the bird, thinking I'm going to eat a piece of chicken tomorrow. Nitzpagla mura. The mura, right, which is said it right the first time, right? The mura, which is the crop. The crop is this part, that's very, very thick. Usually we understand it under the neck. That's full, that where they digest the seeds. It's not really edible. It's not something you want to eat. That becomes pigel. But the opposite would not be true. Mur'ah lo nitpagel alal. If a person is shechs the bird thinking I'm going to eat the mur'ah, I'm going to eat the crop outside of the right place or the right time, that's not considered to be an edible part of the bird, and therefore the rest of the bird does not become pigel. Okay? Continues Rabbi Lazar, the third halacha, which are all complementary. Pigul be'emurim nitpaglu parim. Right? If a person thinks about pigul in the limbs of the what's it called, the karban, then the rest of the karban becomes pigol. The par in this case becomes pigol. But if you're nitpagel, if you're beparim, lo nitpaglu emurim. If you think I'm going to eat the part of the par which is supposed to be burned, right? Because we're talking about parim hanisrafim, then it won't be, because since it's not edible, basically, because it's supposed to be burned on the mizbeach, the emurim do not become pigol. So really, it's the same halacha in three different cases, and we're going to try to prove it all. But basically, Rebbe Lazar's halacha is that there are certain things that are considered to be edible, but they're not considered to be the essential part of the animal. And so if you make the animal pigel and you eat those, you're over for eating pigel. But if you think about those things when you're shechting the animal, it doesn't make the animal pigel. Okay? Let's, says the Gemara, Lema Misayeli. Let us try to prove, and now we're recording this because our Mishnah, you're going to see in a minute, is going to prove this. But before we get to our Mishnah, we go backwards. Lema Misayeli, we're the third to bottom line from Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph. Let us prove Rebbe Lazar's contention. The Braita says later, V'shavim, everybody agrees, right, that if you, where am I? V'shavim, everybody agrees, and this is a halacha of the par that is burned, Shemchishev b'achilat parim b'sreifatam lo asav v'lo klum, that if a person has a machshava to eat part of the par and burn it outside of the Beit HaMikdash, right, outside of the right place, the Chutz Zman or Chutz Komo, it doesn't affect anything, because since the par, remember, is these are the parim that are basically not burned on the mizbeach and not eaten by people at all, right? The parim that don't have any human consumption in them. So because of that, when you think about putting the meat of them in your mouth and eating it tomorrow, it's not considered to be pigel. However, so this is the Gemara later about parim anisrafim. However, says the Gemara later, we're quoting now, second line from the bottom. Where am I? No, that's all we said. That's the bright. My love, says Gemara, hachishev be'emurim mitpaglu parim. The reason that you're not pigol is because you thought I'm going to eat the meat of the carbon, even though you're not supposed to eat the meat of the carbon. But if you thought I'm going to burn the limbs of the carbon, which you're supposed to do, tomorrow, then the animal becomes pigel. And if you eat the meat, you are chai for eating pigel, right? So that's the implication. It's only because you thought about eating the meat, but if you thought about burning the limbs, it would be pigel. It says, well, no, it's not what it means. It means hachishev emurim nitpagu emurim atzman. All it means is that if you had a machshava, you're going to burn the limbs tomorrow, then the limbs become pigel. But the meat of the parim anisrafim maybe never becomes pigel because you're never allowed to eat it. Why aren't you allowed to eat it? Not because it's not edible, but because it's usher to eat. And so things that are usher don't become pigel. So that can't prove it. Okay, so Tashma, let's try to prove it from another Braita. Continues this actually a Mishnah. Says the Mishnah the following. So Mishnah in Me'ilah. Remember, we discussed this a little bit yesterday, right? Because remember, when you dedicate an animal to Hektish, from the moment you dedicate it to Hektish until Hektish uses it, if you improperly use that animal, you're Chayiv Me'ilah. Once Hektish discharges its requirement with it, you're no longer Chayiv Me'ilah. You're not necessarily allowed to have it, but you're not Chayiv Me'ilah. So says the Mishnah in Masechet Me'ilah, Parim hanisrafim, sirim hanisrafim, carbonot that are burned completely, right? There's no human consumption, or sirim that are burned completely. Mo'alim bahem, you're chayiv me'ilah if you use them improperly, mishoktishu, from the moment you made them hektish. Nishchatu, once you shech them, then huchsharu, they became kosher, meaning they became appropriate or available. The pasel b'tful yom, they become pasel if you touched it as a tful yom or mechusar kiburim or belina, right? If someone is tameh because they're tful yom, meaning they went to the mikvah and they have to wait for harav shemesh, or they're waiting for kapara the next day, or the animal's left overnight, then it becomes pasel. Now, my love, that seems to imply lav ninat basar. You see, that's referring to you left over the meat overnight, and shmamina, you see that since migu to pasla belina, since the meat of the animal would be pasla belina, pasla b'machshava. So the implication would be that if you thought about it, right, meaning if you thought, I'm shechting the sa'ir hanisrafim in order to burn it in 2 days, which is chutz lizmano and pigol, the meat becomes pasal pigol, the same way the meat becomes pasal lina. And that proves Rabbi Lazar's contention. Says Merlo, it doesn't necessarily mean that. It might be linat emurim. It might be you're leaving over the limbs of the animal that are supposed to be burned on the mizbeach. Says Gemara, but if that's true, I mean, the next part of the Mishnah says, Kulan mo'alin bahan abit hadeshin. Everything, every part of this animal, everyone agrees that you're a chayiv me'ilah when it's abit hadeshin, right? Abit hadeshin means when it's on the burning place, dasha means ashes, right? When it's aj yutach habasar, until the meat is burned up. Yutach means like consumed, right? So that michlal dereishal ninat basar. Since the sefer of the Mishnah is talking about burning the meat on Beit HaDeshin, it implies that the first part of the Mishnah, which said that you're chayiv for notar, is referring to the basar too. And so if the basar becomes notar, maybe the basar becomes pigel as well. And just not necessarily. Mean the era, who can prove that? Hakidita, hakidita. This part of the Mishnah is referring to this case, and this part of the Mishnah is referring to this case. Resha imurim b'seifa basar. So there's no proof from here that the Mishnah is specifically saying that you're chayav for lina on the meat of a parim hanisrafim. So it may be, and we don't have this resolved yet. We're going to keep discussing it, but we don't have resolved yet what's the status of the meat of an animal that you thought about pigol for that animal. Right? It's clear from our Mishnah that if you thought about eating meat that you're not allowed to eat, that doesn't make it pigol. But if you thought about burning a part that you're supposed to burn and made the animal pigol, does the meat become pigol as well to eat it and be chayv karet? So we haven't proved it yet. Says the Gemara, well, let's see. Rabbah has a proof. Motive Rabbah. Says Rabbah, I've got a proof to you from the following case, right? What does the Mishnah say? It says, ve'elu, and this is a brighter, sorry, later. Elu she'en mifaglim ve'en mitpaglim. The following things cannot become pigol. Sorry, they don't make something pigol. I mean, if you have a thought about doing this while you're bringing the karban, it doesn't make it pigol. Ve'en mitpaglim, and they don't become the object of pigol, meaning if you thought about pigol with the karban, these things are not included. And what are some examples, says the Braita? Tsemer shebarashei kfasim. The wool that's on the head of the kfasim. Most understand this means that even if there's a little bit of meat on the other side of the wool, right? When you take off the wool from an animal, you get some of the skin with it or some of the meat with it. That little bit of meat that comes with it is not considered to be edible. Normally, you don't eat that. Or sa'ar zakan tayashim, or the hair, and again, maybe the same idea of some meat with it that's in the beard of the goats, right? Viha'ar, now ar means leather, right? The hide of an animal. Rotav and kepa, which are things in our Mishnah, the gravy and the spices and the little bits that are left behind. Viha'alal, halal, remember, was that tendon in the neck. Hamura, which is the crop of the bird, so it only applies by birds. Atzamot, the bones. Gidim, the regular tendons. Karnayim, the horns. Tlafayim, the hooves. Shlil, which is the fetus, sorry. Shilya, the placenta. Chalev hamuktashim, milk from karbanot. Ubeitzei torim, and birds from eggs from a bird. So by all of these, continues the Braita, kulan lo mifaglim velo mitpaglim. They don't become pigol, and they don't make the animal pigol. There's no chiyuv of eating them for pigol, notar, and tameh. And if you bring them outside the Beit HaMikdash, you're patur, because, if you make a mizbeach outside and say, I'm burning the skin of this animal, doesn't matter. It's not a korban because it's not meat. So, says the Gemara, that seems pretty clear that these things don't become pigol. This goes against Rebbe Lazar, right? My love must be what the Braita is saying is lo mefaglim hazevach. They don't make the zevach pigol. If you think I'm going to eat the shilya, I'm going to eat the fetus in 2 days, it doesn't make the animal pigol. And if the animal becomes pigol, lo mitpaglim machmat zevach. They don't become pigol from the zevach. If you thought when I'm shechting the animal, I'm going to eat the steak in 2 days, so the animal becomes pigol, the fetus does not become pigol, which goes against what Rebbe Lazar said. Answers Rebbe Lazar, lo, that's not how I would understand it. What it means is the following. Lo mifaglim et hazevach. If you think about them when you bring the karban, you don't make the animal pigol. Velo mitpaglim machmat atzman. They don't even make themselves pigol. So you might have thought, I'm thinking about eating the food of the milk, let's say, in 3 days, that the milk itself should become pigol. Even the milk doesn't become pigol. So the carbon doesn't, and the milk itself doesn't. Says the Gemara, Ihachi, that's what it means. Then it's repetitive. Hamidiktani Seifa. The end of the Mishnah, the end of the Braita says, Kulan lo mefaglim lo mitpaglim hatulamali. If you already said that, you said they don't become pigol, they don't make themselves pigol. Why repeat it again? Says tamech. Well, I don't get it. That's not a question of me. Rebbe Lazar says, according to you, ein chayav mishum pigol. If you say that pigol means that there's no pigol whatsoever, again it's repetitive. Hatulamali. Tonight pigol. Remember, we have this statement. We always say, "Ein chayavim aleim mishum notar tameu pigol." It's like a catchphrase, right? So we really don't need to repeat that you're not chayiv pigol, because we know from the beginning of the Braita that there's no pigol in these things. But when we say, but there's also no issue of tamei and notar, we throw in there's no pigol because it's said together. So hachanami, the same thing would be my answer, which is aidi deboy lemitni hamalem behem bechutz, because you want to say a new case that if you do the karban outside the Beit HaMikdash, you're not chayav for shchutei chutz. We repeat, Taninami, lo mefaglim, kulam, lo mefaglim, lo mitpaglim. So basically, says Rebbe Lazar, I agree that it's repetitive. But you have to admit that the Breita is repetitive too, and it just does that because that's sort of the style of the Breita. But again, we continue, we're going to keep going and now try to prove it from our Mishnah, but we keep having this underlying question, which is that it's no doubt that if you shech the carbon, and when you shech the carbon, you have in mind that you're going to eat or sacrifice a part that's not supposed to be eaten or sacrificed, it doesn't make the animal into pigel. But the question is, if that's something that can also be eaten and the animal becomes pigel, does that part chayav pigel or not? Right? So, for example, the fetus, right? A fetus is very edible. It's not considered an integral part of the animal. So, if you shecht an animal saying, I'm going to eat the fetus of this animal tomorrow or in 2 days, if it's a shlamim, that doesn't make the animal pigel. But there still is a machloket. If you shecht an animal in a thinking I'm going to eat a regular steak tomorrow, so the animal becomes pigel, does the fetus also become pigel from that animal? And if you eat it tomorrow, or eat it today, sorry, will you be chayav for any prohibition? So that remains an open question. And says Rava, I got a proof from our Mishnah. Rava Amar, with the third line of the wide lines on Daf Lamed Hey Amud Bet, says Rava, I agree with Rabbi Lazar, and I think our Mishnah says exactly what Rabbi Lazar said. Afana nami tanina, I also think our Mishnah supports Rabbi Lazar. Because now let's read our Mishnah, which is why we quoted this whole thing. Our Mishnah said, "Hashoched et hamuktashim." A person shechs a carbon, le'echol shlil o shilya bachutz. In order to eat the fetus or the what's it called, the placenta outside. So says our Mishnah, lo pigel, because you're not thinking about eating something that's normally eaten or part of the animal. And hamoleket hatorim, if you slaughter or you do malika, sacrifice birds in order to eat the eggs outside, the chol bitzehem b'chutz, lo pigel. It's the same thing as a placenta. So that's the first part of our Mishnah. V'hadar tani. Now later in the Mishnah it said, chalev hamuktashim, the milk of karbanot, and beitzei torim, and the eggs of a bird, ein chayavim aleim mishum pigel v'notar v'tamei. You're not chayav pigel v'notar v'tamei. But what didn't we say? Ha shalil v'shilya chayavim. It left out the case of the fetus. Why did it leave out the case of the fetus? It must be, like Reb Elazar saying, that in fact, if the animal becomes pigel and you eat the fetus, you are chayav, right? El lav shmamina, what you see from here is that it depends, kan machmat hazevach, that the point is that the fetus cannot represent the carbon. So if you're shechting the carbon with a thought about the fetus, it doesn't make the carbon pigel. But kan machmat atzman. But if you're thinking about itself, right, then basically, sorry, the opposite. If the zevach was pigo, then you're not allowed to eat the shlil and the shilya. But if you thought about eating the shlil and the shilya, that doesn't make the animal pasul shmamina. You in fact can prove from our Mishnah, but you can see from our Mishnah that Rebbe Lazar is correct, and that these parts of the animal, just these parts, not the rest, not the eggs and not the bones, not anything else, but the shlil and the shilya, they are not enough to make the animal pigel. But once the animal is pigel, if there's a shlil and a shilya inside of it, they are over the isser of pigel.
Isn't it the same with egg? Because it's the same thing.
You could say it's distinct, but it's not done. Now we learned in a Mishnah later, and you'll see why this is very, very interesting. To get back to our Mishnah, we'll get to the point. It's going to take us a little bit of time, but by the end of today for sure. The Mishnah says later, this is a Mishnah later in the Masechta, Daf Pei Vav, it says here, Ubalei mumim, right? That this is talking about a case, remember we had this a little bit before, that although you're not allowed to bring certain carbonot or certain things that are a mum on the Mizbeach, there's a rule that if certain things go up on the Mizbeach, they stay up there, right? If it's Olah, lo yireid. And the Mishnah later says that if a Baal Mum is put on the Mizbeach, you generally take it off the Mizbeach, even though it was put up there, meaning an animal had a wound and you didn't know about it. Rabbi Akiva machsher b'bali mumim. Rabbi Akiva says, no, no, no. Even if an animal had a mum and you put it on the mizbeach, you can take it off the mizbeach. Okay, I'm sorry, you can leave it on the mizbeach and burn it there. So even though it shouldn't have been brought, once it was brought on the mizbeach, it's okay to leave it up. That's the Mishnah. Now, says Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Rabbi Yochanan, let me just qualify Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is only saying that you can leave up an animal that has a balmum if it's a minor balmum, like a little doken sheba'ayin usually means a spot in the eye, like a cataract almost. Because that's considered to be a very minor wound, because a bird, you can actually even bring a bird if it has a cataract, right? It doesn't probably mean a cataract, but whatever it means, whatever eye issue. But another detail that's really important is that it's only if you made it hekdesh and then it got a mum. So you made your animal hekdesh, and it was a kosher animal. It became hektish. Then it got a mum. If you then brought it on the mizbeach, says Rabbi Akiva, don't take it off the mizbeach. But that's only true by a minor mum. Now says Rabbi Chia bar Abba, a very interesting point. Mod Rabbi Akiva ba'olat nikeva. Rabbi Akiva admits when you're talking about an ola from a female animal, the keman de kadam muma hekdesh odami, that it's as if the mum came before the hekdesh, and you would have to take it off the mizbeach. Now, of course, everybody knows, surprised that Ken has not screamed at me yet, that an Ola cannot be a female, right? The Torah very clearly says an Ola has to be a Zachar. So by definition, if a person dedicates an animal for an Ola that's a male, that's a female, that's a mum, right? Because a normal, healthy, regular Ola is a male animal. So a female animal, even if it has no wounds, is by definition not appropriate to be a Karban Ola. Let's say a person dedicated a female animal as an olah. It escaped the attention of the Kohanim. No one paid attention. No one looked. They slaughtered the animal. They brought it on the Mizbeach. And they said, oh my God, this is a female. We messed it up. So that's considered to be a mum. And you might think that in that case, Rabbi Akiva would say you can leave the animal on the Mizbeach. Kamashman, that you can't because the mum happened before you made it hektish, because it was a female before you made it hektish. That's a later Gemara. Now, why are we raising this Gemara? Because you have to think about our Mishnah, right? Mativ Rabbi Zera asked a question from the Braita that we quoted earlier, because the Braita said, "Hamaleh mehem b'chutz patur," right? That if you have these animals, and you remember an animal that has a fetus or a placenta or an egg, and you put those on the mizbeach outside the Beit Hamikdash, you're patur because they're not considered to be part of the kudshim. But that implies iman chayav. That if you took the mother and you put it outside, you'd be chayav. But even though the mother, now what mother, of course, presumably we're referring to an olat nikeva, right? Because an olat nikeva is burned completely outside. Usually other carbonates are not burnt outside, or not burned at all. I mean, they're eaten. An olat is burned. An olat nikeva is the only thing that can have a nikeva is the only thing that can have a baby, right? But an ola can't be a nikeva. So how could you have such a case where you're saying the fetus, if you burn it outside, is not over, but the mother would be over? It has to be a case where it's an olat nikeva. How do you have an olat nikeva? It must be a mistake. You mistakenly dedicate an animal that's a female as an ola. So if Rabbi Akiva has the opinion that if an ola nikeva is put on the mizbeach, you don't take it down, then I can understand how many Rabbi Akiva, because that's what happens, right? Basically, you took an ola by mistake that was a female, you put it on the mizbeach. Now, if you burn it outside, you'd be chayav. If you hold that, even according to Rabbi Akiva, that olat nikeva, it's taken off the mizbeach, so this is not a carbon. So it's impossible to have a carbon that the meat of the carbon being brought outside would be over for shchutei chutz or hakravat chutz, because no animal has meat that's brought except for the ola. And the ola can't be a mother, right? So if you have a case where there's a mother and it's an ola, how do you fit that up? So the only possible explanation is Rabbi Akiva, that although an ola can't be a female, if you mistakenly make an ola a female and you put it on the mizbeach, it's okay. So you can have a female ola. Answers the Gemara, no. I have a much better explanation. It's not referring to the meat. Ema hamaleh bahem b'chutz patur. If you put these animals, meaning the fetus, on the mizbeach outside of the Beit HaMikdash, you'd be patur. Ha'me'imurei iman chayav. If you brought the limbs of the mother, it would be chayav, like a shlamim or an asham, or animals that normally bring the limbs that are females. I asked Rav Hamehen Katani. It said Mehen v'ema v'iman dumya ditu. It says them, implying that the mothers are going to be very similar, meaning the same part of the mother as them. Answers the Gemara. We're getting up to the Mishnah. Ela ema hama'aleh emurehem b'chutz patur. You have to add the word emurehem into the bright. If you bring up the limbs of the fetus, you'd be patur. Iman chayav. If you brought up the limbs of the mother, you'd be chayav. So that's how you explain our Mishnah, our Braita, sorry, that's referring to the mother, which is a shlamim or an asham or a chatas, which can be done with females, but not an ola, which can never be done with females. And we will stop at the Mishnah 5 minutes early even, and let them pick it up there tomorrow. Shavua tov, everyone.